What comes to mind when you think of a Viking? The tall, blonde, and blue-eyed warrior, clad in animal furs and ready for battle. It's the image popular culture has sold us for decades, a strong belief that in truth hides a much more complex and controversial reality. The story you were told is incomplete, and today, we're going to fill a gigantic gap. Prepare to meet the man who shatters all your preconceived notions, the Viking who didn't fit any stereotype. His name was Geirmund Heljarskinn, the Black Viking, one of the wealthiest and most powerful settlers in Icelandic history, whose saga was mysteriously erased for centuries. The question that puzzles historians is, how did a man of such importance simply disappear from the most famous legends? And if this story has surprised you, go ahead and leave a like, because your support helps spread this and other forgotten historical truths. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next episodes of our journey. Share with your friends who also love to uncover mysteries of the past, and tell us in the comments what part of the world you're watching from, and what story you'd like us to feature in a future video. Your participation helps keep the flame of knowledge burning. The air of 9th century Norway was heavy with the smell of wood, salt, and ambition. A unified nation didn't exist, but a mosaic of small kingdoms and chiefdoms, each under the command of a jarl or local king who asserted his sovereignty and power. The landscape was dominated by deep fjords, towering mountains, and vast forests. But the true horizon for the Norse was the sea. The spirit of the time was shaped by the promise of plunder, trade, and new lands to be discovered. It was the Viking Age, a period of expansion and violence that would echo for centuries. A man's identity was not defined by a national flag, but by the strength of his drekar, his ship, and the loyalty of his herd, his warband. Kings like Halfdan the Black and his predecessors fought to expand their domains, but the real change was yet to come, driven by one young, ambitious leader. In this scenario of fragmentation and individual bravery, life moved in cycles. Long, dark winter nights were followed by a burst of light and activity in the summer. It was during the summer that the most audacious men embarked on their journeys east or west, in search of glory and riches. Trade blended fluidly with piracy. A Norseman could be a merchant in one port and a raider in another. The routes to the east, in particular, were rich and dangerous, leading the bravest to distant Gardariki, Russia, through vast rivers and forests, where contact with people of other ethnicities was common. It was a world where strength and cunning were the only currencies of value, and where noble lineage, though important, could be surpassed by a warrior's reputation. Amidst this chaos and opportunity, the foundations of a new kingdom were being silently laid, and the ambitions of one man would become the downfall of many's freedom. The socio-economic landscape was sustained by a rigid hierarchical structure. At the top were the kings and jarls, owners of vast lands and almost absolute power. Below them were the carls, the freemen, who cultivated their lands, operated their businesses, and formed the backbone of the army. At the base of the pyramid were the thralls, the slaves, generally captured in battles or expeditions, whose labor was the silent foundation of all Viking prosperity. This structure, though brutal, allowed for a remarkable degree of social mobility, especially for those with a spirit of adventure. Glory in combat and riches acquired in foreign lands could elevate a man, granting him a reputation that even kings had to respect. This quest for honor and fortune was the engine that drove thousands of longships beyond the horizon, and it would be this same quest that led one of the most notable and forgotten leaders to chart his own path to immortality. It was a path paved with blood, gold, and above all, an identity that defied all conventions. The stage was set for the emergence of a hero who would be both part of his people and a stranger among them. Amidst the grandiose sagas of blonde, blue-eyed warriors, whose legends still resonate today, there is a story almost erased by the centuries. It's a narrative that challenges the stereotype that the modern world has so embraced about what it means to be a Viking. This is the saga of Geirmund Heljarskinn, one of the richest and most powerful settlers in Iceland, whose existence, though documented in historical sources, was relegated to the shadows of memory. The silence around his name, in contrast to the fame of figures like Eric the Red or Leif Erikson, is a mystery that intrigues historians and lovers of Norse culture. How could a man of such political and economic importance get lost in the pages of history? The answer may lie in his very essence. Geirmund was not just a warrior or a leader. He was the Black Viking. His story is not a fabricated legend, but a faint echo of a real past, preserved primarily in one crucial source, the Landnámabók, or the Book of Settlements. This medieval Icelandic manuscript is the cornerstone of the island's settlement history, listing the first colonists and their families. Geirmund is mentioned in it as a Norwegian nobleman of great power, one of the first and most prominent settlers. However, even in the sources that cite him, there is a strange silence about the details of his life, as if the scribes had made an effort not to give him the same prominence as his peers. He is not the protagonist of an epic adventure, but a forgotten footnote, a historical enigma. His journey from Norway to Iceland was one of the largest expeditions of his time, yet it's rarely told. The lack of attention to his story raises the suspicion that it was intentionally erased, or that his story was considered less worthy of being narrated. What is known about him comes from fragments, from brief mentions that paint a portrait of a powerful and singular man. He was a leader, not just a warrior, a man capable of organizing a massive fleet and inspiring hundreds of people to follow him into the unknown. He was a shrewd merchant and a successful colonist. However, his reputation and his story were, in some way, diminished by time, or perhaps by a subtle but persistent bias within his own culture. His existence serves as a living, historical refutation of the myth of Viking ethnic purity, showing that Norse society was much more diverse and complex than previously thought. The story of Geirmund is not just about a Viking, but about the importance of questioning established narratives and seeking out the voices that were silenced by time. His saga, though forgotten, carries within it the truth of a people who traveled and interacted with the world in a way that challenges our very understanding. The name Heljarskinn is, in itself, an enigma that carries multiple layers of meaning and ambiguity, serving as the first and most striking clue about Geirmund's identity. The literal translation is Heljarskinn, referencing the goddess of the underworld in Norse mythology, the daughter of Loki. Hel is often depicted with one half of her body decaying, in shades of blue and black, while the other half is of a pale, macabre beauty. Therefore, Heljarskinn could be interpreted as a reference to dark skin, or even an unusual skin color, perhaps bluish or greenish, associated with a state of death or sickness. However, the most accepted interpretation by historians suggests that the nickname was a way to describe his skin color directly, comparing it to the darkness associated with Hel. This interpretation is reinforced by the fact that other Vikings received nicknames based on physical characteristics. The name was not necessarily an insult, but a description. In Norse culture, many warriors and chieftains received epithets that described their appearance, personality, or deeds. Ivar the Boneless and Harald Fairhair are examples of how these nicknames became part of one's identity. In Geirmund's case, the reference to his dark skin was so central to his identity that it became his nickname, even surpassing the name of his lineage. However, this distinction also placed him in a position of notable difference within a society that, although diverse, still valued its Norse heritage. The mention of his dark skin in historical sources is the strongest proof that Viking society was not homogeneous, and that there were people of different ethnicities living among them. The nickname not only describes Geirmund, but also forces us to reevaluate our own perception of who the Vikings were. The use of the words Heljarskinn could also have a deeper connotation, perhaps suggesting that Geirmund was such a fierce warrior that he seemed to have returned from the dead, or that he was immune to death. However, the simplicity of his mixed origin, as will be explored next, points to the more direct explanation. His ancestry, half Norse and half Bjarmanen, justifies his nickname and makes his story even more fascinating. The nickname Heljarskinn is the key to unraveling his saga, a constant reminder that he was an anomaly in his own culture. It wasn't just a detail about his appearance, but an affirmation of his unique identity, which made him one of the most intriguing characters of the entire Viking age. His skin was a sign of his history, his journey, and his destiny. Geirmund's story doesn't begin on Norse soil, but in the distant and mysterious lands of Bjarmaland, a vast and rich region located in the north of modern-day Russia, near the White Sea. It was a place of prosperous trade and icy landscapes, home to Finno-Ugric peoples, but with connections that extended across vast trade routes of the east. It was there that the Norwegian king Hjor Leifsson, Geirmund's father, sailed on an expedition that blended trade and exploration. Unlike the raids in the west, the journey to Bjarmaland was about the exchange of rare and valuable goods, such as animal furs, amber, and metals. Hjor's goal was to enrich his kingdom and his own reputation. During this trip, he met a woman who would change the course of his life and, by extension, that of his people. The account of the meeting is brief and legendary. Ljufina, a Bjarmanan princess, was captivated by Hjor. The sagas describe her as a woman of great beauty, but without going into details about her physical appearance. However, her son's nickname and descriptions of the Bjarmanan peoples suggest she had features that distinguished her from the Norse, likely with darker skin and more Eastern or Siberian characteristics. The relationship between Hjor and Ljufina resulted in a marriage, uniting the Norse royal lineage with the nobility of distant Bjarmaland. This marriage was not a mere romantic act, but a political and economic pact. The union strengthened Hjor's trade ties in the east, ensuring access to a continuous source of wealth. Ljufina was not a trophy wife. She became a figure of power and influence, traveling with Hjor back to Norway. Ljufina's arrival in Hjor's kingdom must have been an event of great impact. The foreign princess, with her distinct culture and appearance, brought with her not only the wealth of her homeland, but also the seed of a new lineage. Her presence at the Norwegian court serves as a silent testament that cultural and racial boundaries were not as rigid in the Viking Age as the modern stereotype suggests. Norse society was a melting pot of peoples, and the relationship between Hjor and Ljufina is proof of that. Their son, Geirmund, would be the result of this union, a being from two worlds carrying the blood of two peoples in his veins, and the seed of a story that would defy the conventions of his own era. The love or agreement between a king and a princess from distant lands planted the seed for the saga of one of the most singular characters in all of Viking history, a man who would lead thousands into the unknown. The birth of Geirmund was an event that mixed the blood of two distinct cultures, the cold of Norway with the mystery of Bjarmaland. His arrival in the world was not just the birth of an heir, but of a being who would forever be a reminder of the union of his father, the Norwegian king Hjor Leifsson, with the dark-skinned princess Ljufina. The nickname Heljarskinn that he would later receive is proof that his appearance, particularly the color of his skin, was remarkably different from most of the Norse. In a society where light skin was the norm, Geirmund stood out from the beginning. His mixed heritage was not a secret but a striking characteristic that defined his identity. He was a Norseman by birth, but his appearance connected him to distant lands and a lineage that was outside the tradition of his people. His skin color was, therefore, more than a physical characteristic. It was a symbol of his unique origin and his condition as a foreigner within his own nobility. Although he was the son of a king and the heir to a kingdom, he did not fit the standard mold of heroes from the sagas. This difference may have been a source of pride for Geirmund, a sign of his heritage and his connections to the rich eastern lands of his mother, but it must also have been a source of stigma, of curious glances, and perhaps of subtle prejudice. His presence at the Norwegian court challenged the idea of racial homogeneity that we today associate with Vikings. He was living proof that the Viking Age was a period of cultural and ethnic exchange, where geographical boundaries were crossed frequently, and the mixing of peoples was a reality. Geirmund grew up in a society that valued strength, honor, and lineage, but his appearance forced him to forge his own identity, to prove his worth not just by his noble blood, but by his deeds. His dark skin distinguished him and placed him under a social microscope from an early age. The weight of his appearance, which would later earn him the legendary nickname, likely pushed him to be even more formidable, to excel in combat, trade, and leadership skills, so that his reputation would overcome any prejudice. His story is a reminder that strength and leadership were not exclusive to one type of person in the Viking Age, and that diversity was an intrinsic part of Norse culture, no matter how much history tried to erase it. He was the child of two worlds, an heir of a Norse royal lineage, and of the wisdom of the peoples of the East, and this duality would shape his destiny irreversibly. Geirmund's childhood was shaped by his mixed heritage and the expectations of a Viking society that valued strength above all else. Growing up in a world of kings, jarls, and warriors, he was trained from an early age in the arts of war and navigation, but also in the complexities of commerce and politics. While other young nobles sought glory on local battlefields, Geirmund, with his Bjarmanen blood, looked to the east. The fame he built came not only from his skill with a sword and shield, but also from his cunning as a merchant. He understood that true power in the Viking Age came not just from plundered gold, but also from wealth accumulated through strategic exchanges. His mind was as sharp as his blade, and he used this intelligence to build a network of trade that extended far beyond Norway's borders. His skill in navigating and trading in foreign waters and lands earned him a legendary reputation. The sagas describe him as a man of great ingenuity, capable of obtaining rare and valuable goods that could not be found in Scandinavia. This ability to bring wealth to his people made his reputation grow and overcome any stigma attached to his appearance. He became a self-made man, someone whose fame depended not just on his lineage, but on his own deeds. His rise was fast and well-deserved, transforming him from a foreigner at his father's court into one of the most respected leaders of his time. He was not just a prince, he was a leader of men, a capable warrior, and a shrewd negotiator. His fame was not limited to his homeland but echoed throughout Scandinavia. Other chieftains saw him as a rival, and his peers respected him. The beginning of his adulthood was a series of successes that prepared him for the epic journey that would come. His character was forged in long expeditions and complicated negotiations, making him a leader prepared to face the challenges of a world in constant change. He was not just a prince, he was a leader of men, a capable warrior, and a shrewd negotiator. This combination of strength, intelligence, and cunning made him a force to be reckoned with, and a man who would refuse to submit to anyone. His fame, built with so much effort, would be what would lead him to an inevitable clash with the growing power of Harald Fairhair. His journey to becoming one of the great names of the Viking Age was just beginning. The true forging of Geirmund's character and the source of his vast wealth were his expeditions to the east. Instead of joining his peers in raids in the west, Geirmund, influenced by his mother's heritage and his father's wisdom, directed his ambition to the trade routes of Eastern Europe. Sailing the Volga River, the backbone of a vast commercial empire, he came into contact with Slavic, Finno-Ugric, and Arab peoples. The routes to the east, known as the Path to the Varangians, were an inexhaustible source of wealth. Through trade, the Vikings obtained valuable goods such as furs, wax, honey, and, most importantly, silver in Arab coins, the dirhams. Geirmund became a master at this game, using his cunning and reputation to negotiate and acquire a considerable fortune. These expeditions were not just about trade, they were also about learning. Geirmund learned about different cultures, religions, and war tactics. He was exposed to a world much vaster and more diverse than that of Scandinavia, and this experience shaped him as a leader with a global vision. Unlike the Vikings who focused on raids and plunder, Geirmund focused on building commercial bridges. He understood that long-term trade was more profitable and sustainable than one-off plundering. His reputation as a reliable merchant and a formidable warrior made him one of the richest men of his time. He was not just a raider, he was a magnate, a strategist who used trade to accumulate power. His familiarity with the eastern routes and contact with the dark-skinned and eastern peoples of those regions possibly reinforced his own mixed identity and made him more comfortable with his own appearance. His dark skin, which could have been a disadvantage in Scandinavia, was perhaps a symbol of his authenticity and his travels in distant lands, which gave him even more prestige. These expeditions were the final preparation for his journey to Iceland. The experience of sailing long distances, dealing with people of different cultures, and building an empire based on trade made him the ideal leader for the colonization of a new land. Without the riches and knowledge he acquired in the East, his expedition to Iceland, described next, would not have been possible. While Geirmund built his fortune and fame on the eastern routes, a powerful and unifying force was emerging in Norway. The young and ambitious King Harald Fairhair was determined to fulfill a promise he had made in his youth. He would not cut his hair until Norway was under his rule. His unification campaign was ruthless and bloody. Battles were fought, kingdoms were conquered, and the opposition was crushed. Harald's goal was not just personal glory but the creation of a unified nation. He believed that Norway's prosperity depended on a strong central power, capable of controlling trade, enforcing the law, and ending the constant internal wars between local chieftains. His vision, however, was a direct threat to the freedom and power of men like Geirmund, who prided themselves on their autonomy. Harald's campaign culminated in the decisive Battle of Hafrsfjord, around 872 AD, an event that is considered the turning point in Norway's history. Harald's victory over a coalition of small kings and jarls secured his dominance over most of the country. With unification came a new order. Harald imposed taxes on lands and trade and demanded the loyalty of all nobles. The leaders who refused to submit were forced into exile. Harald's new order meant that power no longer belonged to individual jarls, but to a single king. For many, the choice was simple: submit or be destroyed. But for men like Geirmund, submission was an affront to his honor and an unacceptable sacrifice of his freedom. The rise of Harald Fairhair is the driving force behind Geirmund's story. It is the event that creates the tension and urgency necessary for the journey to Iceland. Without the threat of a unifying king, Geirmund's decision to abandon his lands and family to seek a new home would not make sense. The conflict between Harald's ambition for a unified kingdom and Geirmund's desire for freedom is the core of the narrative. Harald represents the inevitability of change and the force of destiny. Geirmund, in turn, represents the untamable spirit of the individual, who refuses to bow before authority. The Battle of Hafrsfjord was not just the end of a conflict. It was the catalyst for the journey of many Vikings to the west, a movement that would give rise to a new nation and the saga of a forgotten hero. The arrival of Harald Fairhair's power forced Geirmund to make an impossible decision. His fame, wealth, and reputation as an autonomous and powerful leader put him on a collision course with the new order. The choice was clear: submit, pay taxes to Harald and recognize him as his sovereign, or resist and risk losing everything in a conflict against the war machine of a unifying king. For Geirmund, a man who had built his own empire of wealth and fame, submission was not an option. His pride and his sense of freedom were non-negotiable. He refused to bow. His decision, however, was not an empty boast, but a calculated choice. He knew that resisting Harald on Norwegian soil would be a losing battle. The solution was not to fight the king, but to flee his domain. Iceland, recently discovered and unexplored, offered the promise of a new beginning, a place where freedom and autonomy could be preserved. Although the land was inhospitable and unknown, it was a refuge for those who refused to live in the shadow of a king. Geirmund was not the only one to make this decision. His journey was part of a large migratory movement of Norwegian Vikings fleeing Harald's reign. But his expedition was different. Unlike the settlers who left with a handful of ships and men, Geirmund left with a war fleet and a retinue of hundreds of followers, including his family, his warriors, and his slaves. He was not just looking for a new home. He was moving his entire kingdom. His decision to leave was an act of defiance and faith. It was a farewell to his homeland and a way of life that was about to become obsolete. He and his followers would become pioneers, the first to establish a new society in a land without kings and without taxes. His departure marked the end of his life as a Norwegian jarl and the beginning of his journey as one of the most important landnámsmenn, settlers, in Icelandic history. His flight to the west was the direct consequence of the conflict with Harald, the event that marked the end of an era in Norway and the beginning of a new nation in the North Atlantic. His journey was about to begin, an epic journey that would test his leadership, his strength, and his vision. The announcement of Geirmund's departure was not a simple warning but a declaration of intent to build a new nation on virgin lands. The decision to abandon Norway under the shadow of Harald Fairhair was not one of cowardice, but of an audacity that bordered on madness. Geirmund's plan was monumental. It was not a reconnaissance expedition, but a mass migration, an undertaking that would require resources, courage, and an unwavering faith. He did not leave with just a handful of ships, but with a fleet. Iceland, a distant and unexplored island, known only from brief accounts and legends, was the destination. For many, the journey seemed like a leap into the abyss, but for Geirmund, it was the only way to preserve his freedom and his power. He began to mobilize his vast network of contacts. He used his fortune, accumulated over years of trade in the East, to finance the construction of new ships and the purchase of provisions. His reputation as a capable leader and a formidable warrior helped him attract hundreds of followers. They were minor jarls who also refused to submit to Harald, entire families who sought a life free from taxes and royal oppression, and, crucially, a significant number of slaves, whose labor would be fundamental to the success of the settlement. The legend of Geirmund, the Black Viking, spread, attracting all types of people, from the desperate to the ambitious. His fleet, slowly forming in the fjords of Norway, became a symbol of resistance and hope for those who felt oppressed. The decision to leave for Iceland was the act of a visionary. Geirmund was not just fleeing, he was founding a new society. He saw the opportunity to create a free realm, where the ancient laws and traditions of Norse freedom could prosper without the interference of a king. The plan was risky, the journey was dangerous, and the future was uncertain. But for the men and women who joined him, the promise of a life without Harald's rule was a reward worthy of any risk. Geirmund was becoming more than a warrior. He was a leader, a prophet, and a beacon for all those who refused to bow. His journey was about to begin, and with it, one of the greatest colonization sagas in history. If you're finding this story epic and intriguing, show your support. Leave a like so more people can discover the true and diverse history of the Vikings. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next episodes of this journey. Share with your friends to help spread this knowledge, and tell us in the comments what part of the world you're watching from, and if you'd like to suggest a story for our next videos. Your participation helps keep the flame of knowledge burning. Geirmund's call for the colonization of Iceland echoed throughout Norway, but his audience was not homogeneous. He didn't just recruit warriors, but he summoned an entire community. His fleet would be a microcosm of Viking society, reflecting the complex hierarchy and diversity of which he himself was an example. Freemen, known as carls, joined him with their families and possessions, seeking a life without the new impositions of Harald Fairhair. They were farmers, artisans, and small traders, the backbone of the expedition. Their bonds with Geirmund were of loyalty and a common interest in autonomy. They saw in him a leader who not only promised freedom, but personified it. Geirmund's expedition also included a significant number of thralls, or slaves, captured in expeditions in the east and west. They didn't join by choice, but as part of their lord's property. However, their presence was crucial. Their labor would be the foundation of the new colony, building houses, clearing land, and cultivating the new farm. The presence of slaves of diverse origins, including Celts, Slavs, and possibly Eastern peoples, added another layer to the diversity of the expedition. It was a brutal and pragmatic reminder of the reality of Viking society, where a man's life could be reduced to mere property. They would be the silent force that would make Geirmund's plan a reality. The most fascinating thing about Geirmund's summoning was his ability to attract followers from all social levels. He was not just a leader for the nobles, but a beacon for all who sought a new beginning. His reputation as a warrior, merchant, and, above all, as a man who refused to bow, gave him a credibility that few figures of his time possessed. He promised not just land, but the founding of an ideal, a society where freedom and autonomy were the foundation. The fleet he assembled was a testament to his leadership and charisma, and the harbinger of a new nation that would be built on virgin lands. His expedition was more than a journey. It was a movement, and every person on board, whether by choice or by coercion, was a vital part of the story that was about to be written. His fleet, gathered in the fjords, was an impressive sight of an entire community about to embark on the unknown. What sets Geirmund's expedition apart from other colonization journeys is its scale. The Landnámabók, the main source on the settlement of Iceland, describes his fleet as one of the largest and best equipped. Geirmund's saga speaks of many ships, filled with men, women, children, and cattle. This was not the journey of a band of adventurers, but the migration of an entire community. organized and led by a man of vast wealth and power. The size of Geirmund's fleet reflects the seriousness of his project. He was not just looking for a place to live, but to build a miniature empire. His ambition was to found a colony that could sustain and prosper, and for that, he needed numbers. Geirmund's fleet was an impressive sight. Dozens of longships, their polished hulls and painted sails, loaded with provisions and people. Each ship was an autonomous unit, but all sailed under Geirmund's command. The scale of the expedition was a reflection of his power and his ability to mobilize resources. Unlike other settlers who left with a handful of ships, Geirmund seemed to be moving with his own kingdom. This magnitude also suggests the deep opposition he felt toward Harald's reign. He was not just fleeing, but making a visible act of protest, taking with him a significant part of the nobility and population that refused to submit. The size of the expedition was also a tactical and strategic advantage. A large fleet offered more safety against the dangers of the sea, and a large retinue of settlers ensured that the labor force would be sufficient to face the challenge of a new settlement. His expedition was, in essence, a demonstration of power. Geirmund was showing Harald that his autonomy was stronger than royal authority. The scale of his journey, however, also made it more vulnerable. A large fleet required more provisions, more discipline, and impeccable leadership. Any navigation error or an unexpected storm could mean the end of hundreds of lives and the failure of his plan. His journey to Iceland was, therefore, a high-stakes gamble, a final test of his leadership and his destiny. The journey of Geirmund and his fleet across the North Atlantic was a testament to his courage and his skill as a sailor. The longships, although designed for speed and battle, were not the most comfortable means for a long and cold crossing. The vessels were open to the weather, exposing passengers and provisions to the elements. Navigation was done by rudimentary methods, using the position of the sun, the stars, and the direction of ocean currents. The journey was, at best, dangerous, and at worst, fatal. However, the Vikings were the masters of the seas, and their confidence in their ships was unshakable. Geirmund's voyage was long and full of challenges. The fleet had to face the unforgiving storms of the North Atlantic, the biting cold, and the uncertainty of sailing in uncharted waters. The unity of the fleet was the only guarantee of safety. If a ship was lost or damaged, the rest of the fleet could offer help. However, the real challenge was not the sea, but managing hundreds of people. The leader had to ensure that provisions lasted, morale remained high, and tensions between the different groups of followers didn't turn into conflict. Geirmund's leadership was tested every day of the voyage. He had to be a beacon of hope and strength for those who followed him. The success of the crossing was a matter of life and death. A navigation error, a strong storm, or a disease on board could mean the end of the expedition. The journey of Geirmund and his followers is one of the greatest epics of colonization in history. They risked everything for a promise of freedom. The saga does not go into details about the challenges faced during the voyage, but it's easy to imagine the days of despair, the nights of vigil, and the relief they felt upon sighting land. The arrival in Iceland was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new challenge, that of building a new home on virgin land. The crossing of the North Atlantic was the final rite of passage, transforming a group of Norwegian refugees into fearless settlers. The sight of land after weeks of open sea must have been a moment of relief and renewed hope for Geirmund and his followers. Iceland, with its volcanic landscapes, its ice-capped mountains, and its lava fields, was different from anything they had ever seen. The land was inhospitable and virgin, but it was free. Unlike other settlers, who followed the ritual of throwing their high-seat pillars into the water and settling where they washed ashore, Geirmund, with his fleet and his long-term vision, made a careful search for a suitable location. He was not just looking for a place to camp, he was looking for a place to build a society. The search for a settlement site was a strategic decision. The land had to be able to sustain a large community, with access to water, pastures for cattle, and natural resources. He sailed along the island's coast, exploring the fjords and bays in search of the perfect place. His knowledge of navigation, accumulated over years of trade in the East, gave him an invaluable advantage. He knew how to read the land and the sea. The place he chose, Bardastrand, in northwestern Iceland, was ideal for his purposes. The location had a safe bay for his ships, green fields for cattle, and access to natural resources. The arrival in Iceland was not just a historical event, but a moment of profound cultural significance. They were not just moving to a new land, they were becoming the founders of a new nation. His search for a settlement site is a reflection of his character as a leader. He was not just interested in his own survival, but in the future of all who followed him. He wanted to ensure that his community had the best chance of prospering. His arrival in Iceland and his choice of Bardastrand was the turning point in his saga. It was the moment when the journey ended and the work of building a new life began. Geirmund's vision would become a reality, and his colony would become one of the richest and most powerful on the island. With the settlement site chosen, Geirmund and his vast retinue began the arduous work of transforming the virgin land into a home. The great farm he founded was named Geirmundarstaðir, Geirmund's place, a name that echoed his importance and his leadership. The scale of the settlement was impressive and demonstrated the wealth and planning behind the expedition. It was not a common farm, but a true economic fortress. With hundreds of people at his service, including his slaves, Geirmund managed to clear and cultivate a vast area of land, build houses, barns, and other structures in record time. The Geirmundarstaðir farm became a center of power and prosperity. Geirmund's success was due to his strategic vision and his vast fortune. He had the necessary resources to invest in cattle, provisions, and tools. His experience as a merchant in the East helped him establish trade routes with other settlers and, possibly, with the mainland. His farm was not just a place to live, but a center of commerce. His wealth and political power grew exponentially as the colony prospered. He became one of the most influential leaders in Iceland, and his farm became a point of reference for all who arrived on the island. Geirmundarstaðir was not just a settlement, it was a declaration of power and autonomy. It was proof that Geirmund's vision of building a kingdom without kings was possible. He had transformed the inhospitable land into a home and into a center of power. His success served as an inspiration and example for other settlers, and his name became synonymous with prosperity and leadership. The contrast between his success and his later disappearance from the most famous sagas is one of the most fascinating mysteries of Viking history. His farm, Geirmundarstaðir, was living proof of his legacy, a silent testament to an epic journey and a leader who defied the conventions of his time. Iceland was settled by a series of leaders, the landnámsmenn, who arrived on the island fleeing the reign of Harald Fairhair in Norway. Each of these settlers established their own settlement and asserted their power over a portion of land. However, Geirmund's role as one of the first and most prominent landnámsmenn is undeniable. He was not just another settler, he was a leader of men and a figure of great political importance. His wealth, his power, and his vast retinue gave him an advantage over the other settlers. He did not have to fight for his land like others, but chose it and dominated it with his strength and power. His leadership was crucial for the survival and prosperity of his colony. He not only established his farm, but also helped shape Icelandic society. His decisions, alliances, and rivalries helped form the political landscape of the island. He was one of the great men of early Iceland, one of the pillars on which the new nation was built. However, his saga, unlike that of other landnámsmenn, is not so celebrated. His historical importance is undeniable, but his memory was in some way diminished. The reason for this is a mystery, but his existence as one of the founders of Iceland is a historical fact. His role as a landnámsmaður, the singular form of landnámsmenn, was not limited to his own colony. He had connections with other settlers and actively participated in the political life of the island. His presence in Iceland was a force to be reckoned with. His story, however, is that of a man who became a legend, but whose legacy was obscured. His journey to Iceland and his rise as one of the main settlers are a testament to his leadership and ambition, but also a reminder that history is often written by those who have the power to shape the narrative. Geirmund's saga is not just about a man, but about a family. His family, with its mix of Norse and Bjarmanan blood, was a reflection of his own identity. His lineage was living proof of the diversity of the Viking age. Geirmund married in Iceland, and his children carried the same blood of two cultures. His family was a microcosm of the society he was trying to build, a society where origin was not an impediment to success. His son and his grandchildren inherited his wealth and his influence, and his lineage became one of the most powerful in Iceland. However, the history of Geirmund's family is also a mystery. His saga does not detail the fate of his lineage clearly. The lack of information about his family is another proof that his story was, in some way, erased. What is known is that his descendants became prominent figures in Iceland, but their connection to the Black Viking was, in some way, lost or intentionally ignored. The history of Geirmund's family is a reminder that history is often written to fit a narrative. The diversity of Geirmund's lineage did not fit the ideal of a homogeneous society, and because of this, his story and that of his family were cast aside. The role of his family in the new land was to continue his legacy. They were the heirs of his wealth, his power, and his vision. They were the future of the colony he had founded. The history of his family is a crucial part of his saga, but it is also a part that was silenced. The lack of information about the fate of his lineage is one of the most fascinating mysteries of his story. His family, with its mix of Norse and Geirmund blood, was living proof that Viking society was more complex and diverse than was thought. The prosperity of Geirmund's colony came not only from his leadership and his vision, but from a well-planned and sustainable economy. His vast fortune, accumulated in his expeditions in the east, was the foundation of his new society. He invested in cattle, seeds, and tools, ensuring that his colony had what was needed to prosper. His economy was based on three pillars: trade, fishing, and cattle raising. Trade was his specialty, and he used his connections to establish trade routes with other settlers, and possibly with the mainland. Fishing, abundant in the cold waters of Iceland, and cattle raising, which adapted well to the island's climate, were the basis of subsistence. However, the prosperity of his colony was driven by the labor of slaves, the thralls. His expedition included a large number of slaves, and their labor was the silent foundation of all prosperity. They were the workforce that built the houses, cleared the lands, and cared for the cattle. The life of a slave in Viking society was brutal, but their presence was crucial to the success of the colonization. Their existence is a dark reminder of the reality of the Viking Age. Geirmund's economy was a mix of pragmatism and vision. He understood that long-term prosperity was more important than immediate plunder. His colony was not just a refuge, but an economic center. His success was an example for other settlers, and a testament to his skill as a leader and a strategist. His wealth was proof that his vision of a new society was possible. His economy was the foundation of his political power and his influence in the new nation. Iceland, although vast, was not free of conflict. The arrival of Geirmund and his vast retinue generated tensions with other settlers who had already established themselves on the island. Geirmund's power and wealth were a threat to the autonomy of other chieftains. The rivalry between the landnámsmenn was a reality of life in Iceland, and control over land and resources was the main source of conflict. The sagas speak of disputes and battles between the settlers, and it is likely that Geirmund, with his power and influence, was involved in many of these conflicts. His strength, however, was an advantage. His large retinue of warriors and followers ensured that he could defend his interests and expand his power. His alliances were strategic, and his rivalries were calculated. He knew that political power in Iceland depended on his ability to form alliances and fight for his interests. Tensions with other settlers were a natural part of the colonization process. His ability to handle these conflicts is a testament to his skill as a leader and a politician. The lack of details about Geirmund's battles is one of the mysteries of his saga. The sagas of other Vikings are filled with details about their battles and victories. The lack of information about Geirmund's conflicts suggests that his story was, in some way, edited. His life was no doubt full of conflicts, but his story is told in a way that minimizes his importance. His role as a political leader and military strategist is, however, undeniable. Geirmund's power was not based solely on his wealth and military strength, but also on his skill as a politician. He knew that power in Iceland depended on his ability to form alliances and influence the decisions of other settlers. He used his wealth and reputation to establish ties with other leaders. forming a network of alliances that guaranteed his security and influence. He became a great man in Iceland, a leader whose power was respected by all other settlers. His influence was such that he could resolve disputes, mediate conflicts, and influence laws. He was one of the pillars of the new Icelandic society, a leader who helped shape the political landscape of the island. His vision of a society free of kings and taxes was the driving force behind him. He wanted to ensure that his new nation was built on the principles of freedom and autonomy. His political power was proof that his vision was possible. The lack of details about his political role is another one of the mysteries of his saga. The sagas of other leaders are filled with details about their political intrigues. His story, however, is told in a way that minimizes him. His existence as one of the political leaders of Iceland is a fact, but his story was, in some way, obscured. His role as a leader and a politician is, however, undeniable. Geirmund's story is a paradox. He was one of the richest and most powerful men of his time, a leader who mobilized one of the largest colonization expeditions in history. However, his story is almost unknown. In contrast, the sagas of other Vikings, like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson, are known worldwide. The lack of recognition for Geirmund is a mystery that intrigues historians. How could a man of such importance get lost in the pages of history? The answer may lie in his very essence. His dark skin, his Bjarman heritage, and his connection to the East may have been the reason his story did not fit the ideal narrative of the Viking Age. The stereotype that Vikings were a blonde, blue-eyed people was popular at the time, and the story of a Black Viking did not fit that ideal. His story was, in some way, edited and minimized to conform to a narrative that celebrated Norse purity. His legacy was obscured so that the history of Iceland could be told in a way that celebrated ethnic homogeneity. The lack of recognition for Geirmund is a reminder that history is often written by those who have the power to shape the narrative. His story is an example of how history can be erased and silenced. His legacy is a testament to his importance, but the lack of recognition is a reminder that history can be unjust. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. Geirmund's story is not an isolated case, but part of a larger picture that reveals the true diversity of the Viking Age. Accounts from Arab, Byzantine, and Saxon chroniclers of the 9th and 10th centuries describe Norse warriors who did not fit the traditional stereotype. Sources like the manuscripts of the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who described the Rus, Vikings who sailed the eastern routes, on his journey along the Volga River, mention the presence of men he describes as tall as date palms, but does not mention their skin color or traits that relate to a European phenotype. Other chronicles speak of Vikings with black hair and dark skin who mingled with the peoples they encountered on their expeditions. The presence of Vikings of other ethnicities is attested by recent archaeological discoveries and genetic analyses. Skeletons found at Viking sites in Scandinavia and Iceland have revealed that many individuals had a mix of genetic heritage, with links to Southern Europe and even the Middle East. The exchange of cultures and peoples was a reality of the Viking Age, and the Vikings' trade and raiding routes took them to distant lands, where contact with people of other ethnicities was common. They not only plundered, but also married, traded with and enslaved people of different origins. Geirmund's story is therefore living proof that the stereotype that all Vikings were blonde and blue-eyed is incorrect. His saga, although marginalized, is a reminder that history is more complex, and that diversity was an intrinsic part of Viking society. The presence of Vikings of other ethnicities in accounts and historical evidence serves as a backdrop for Geirmund's story, showing that he was not an anomaly, but rather an example of a reality that history tried to erase. His legacy is proof that Viking society was more open and inclusive than was thought. Slavery was a fundamental part of Viking society and one of the main drivers of its economy. The Vikings captured slaves, the thralls, on their raiding expeditions, and most of them came from Ireland, Scotland, and England. However, their trade routes in the East also gave them access to slaves of Slavic, Byzantine, and even Arab origins. The presence of slaves of different ethnicities in Scandinavia and Iceland is one of the main factors that contributed to the diversity of Viking society. The slaves were the workforce that built the great farms, took care of the cattle, and operated the businesses. Their labor was the silent foundation of all Viking prosperity. They were the property of their lords, and their life was brutal and without rights. However, their presence in Viking society is proof that society was not ethnically homogeneous. Their presence in Geirmund's expedition and in his colony is a reminder that the diversity of the Viking Age was, in part, a result of slavery. Geirmund's story and his own mixed heritage are proof that Viking society was not limited to just one ethnicity. His story is a reminder that history is often written by the victors, but that the voices of those who were enslaved are also a crucial part of history. The role of slavery in Viking society and its influence on ethnic diversity is one of the most important themes of Viking history, and Geirmund's story is a perfect example. Viking society, though diverse, was not free of prejudice and challenges. Life in a multi-ethnic society was full of tensions and conflicts. People of different origins faced stigma and prejudice. Geirmund's story is that of a man who stood out in a society that did not fit his profile. His dark skin and his Bjarmanen heritage made him a foreigner in his own land. His story is that of a man who had to prove his worth and his loyalty to a society that viewed him with suspicion. Prejudice in the Viking Age was not necessarily about race, but about lineage and origin. His Bjarmanen heritage put him at a disadvantage, but his wealth and his reputation as a warrior and a merchant gave him the advantage to overcome prejudice. His story is a reminder that Viking society was a mix of peoples and cultures, and that life in a multi-ethnic society was full of challenges and opportunities. His story is that of a man who, despite all the challenges, managed to stand out and become one of the most prominent leaders of his time. He is an example that strength and leadership were not exclusive to one type of person in the Viking Age. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. Despite the evidence about Geirmund's origin, some historians question whether the nickname Heljarskinn was about his race or just a deep tan. The nickname Heljarskinn is ambiguous, and its interpretation depends on a series of factors. The lack of information about the appearance of his mother, the Bjarmanen princess Ljufina, makes it difficult to be certain about his origin. However, his Bjarmanen heritage and his connection to the East suggest that the nickname was about his origin. The uncertainty about Geirmund's nickname is a reminder that history is often a matter of interpretation. The lack of historical sources about his life makes it difficult to be certain about his appearance. However, his story is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. Geirmund's nickname is, however, the key to unraveling his saga. It is a reminder that his story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. The uncertainty about Geirmund's nickname is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. Geirmund's saga, although important, was preserved in only one single source, the Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements. This manuscript is a crucial historical source on the colonization of Iceland, but Geirmund's saga is only a footnote. His story, unlike that of other Vikings, was not told in detail in other sources. The lack of information about his life in other sagas is one of the most fascinating mysteries of his story. His saga was, in some way, ignored or minimized. The lack of information about his life suggests that his story was, in some way, edited. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. The lack of information about his life is a reminder that history is often written to fit a narrative. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His saga is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. The Icelandic historian Bergsveinn Birgisson dedicated years to research on Geirmund and his saga. His book, The Black Viking, is a detailed analysis of the reason for Geirmund's forgetting. Birgisson argues that his story was, in some way, erased or minimized because of his appearance. His dark skin and his Bjarmanen heritage made him a foreigner in his own land. His story did not fit the ideal of a homogeneous society, and because of that, his story was cast aside. Bergeson's analysis is a refutation of the myth that all Vikings were blonde and blue-eyed. He argues that Viking society was more diverse and complex than was thought. His analysis is a reminder that history is often written to fit a narrative. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. Bergeson's analysis is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. The conspiracy of silence theory is one of the most fascinating and controversial about Geirmund's saga. The theory argues that Geirmund's story was intentionally suppressed for reasons of prejudice. His dark skin and his Bjarmanen heritage made him a foreigner in his own land. His story did not fit the ideal of a homogeneous society, and because of that, his story was cast aside. The conspiracy of silence theory is a refutation of the myth that all Vikings were blonde and blue-eyed. The theory argues that Geirmund's story was intentionally suppressed to conform to a narrative that celebrated Norse purity. His story is a reminder that history is often written by the victors, but that the voices of those who were silenced are also a crucial part of history. The conspiracy of silence theory is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was in some way obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. The conspiracy of silence theory is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. Geirmund's story, like that of other Vikings, was transmitted for generations through oral sagas. His saga was told and retold by poets and storytellers, and his story was, in some way, altered and adapted over time. His saga was finally recorded in a manuscript, the Landnámabók, but his story was, in some way, edited and minimized. The lack of information about his life in other sagas is one of the most fascinating mysteries of his story. His saga is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His saga is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was in some way obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. Iceland, although it had been colonized by a group of leaders and families, was becoming an organized society. The era of colonization was coming to an end, and the beginning of the stabilization phase was on its way. Icelandic society, which had been based on small communities and small kingdoms, was becoming a more organized society. Its society, which had been based on small communities and small kingdoms, was becoming a more organized society. Its society, which had been based on small communities and small kingdoms, was becoming a more organized society. The end of the colonization era is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His story is that of a man who, despite all the challenges, managed to stand out and become one of the most prominent leaders of his time. He is an example that strength and leadership were not exclusive to one type of person in the Viking Age. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. Geirmund's saga, although important, does not give us clear details on how and when he died. His death is one of the most fascinating mysteries of his story. The sagas of other Vikings are full of details about their battles and victories. His death, however, is almost completely ignored. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was in some way obscured. His death is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His story is that of a man who, despite all the challenges, managed to stand out and become one of the most prominent leaders of his time. He is an example that strength and leadership were not exclusive to one type of person in the Viking Age. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. The fate of Geirmund's lineage is one of the most intriguing mysteries of his saga. His family, with its mix of Norse and Geirmund blood, was living proof of the diversity of the Viking Age. However, his saga does not give us clear details about the fate of his lineage. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His family is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His story is that of a man who, despite all the challenges, managed to stand out and become one of the most prominent leaders of his time. He is an example that strength and leadership were not exclusive to one type of person in the Viking Age. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. Geirmund's story, like that of other Vikings, was transmitted for generations through oral sagas. His saga was told and retold by poets and storytellers, and his story was, in some way, altered and adapted over time. His saga was finally recorded in a manuscript, the Landnámabók, but his story was, in some way, edited and minimized. The lack of information about his life in other sagas is one of the most fascinating mysteries of his story. His saga is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His saga is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. Geirmund's story is living proof that the stereotype that all Vikings were blonde and blue-eyed is incorrect. His saga, although marginalized, is a reminder that history is more complex and that diversity was an intrinsic part of Viking society. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His story is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His story is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. Geirmund's legacy is not just his saga, but his contribution to the founding of a new nation. His vision of a society free of kings and taxes became a reality. Iceland became a republic, and power shifted from individual leaders like Geirmund to a collective political structure, the Althing, the first parliament. His story is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time and who, because of that, was forgotten by history. His story is a reminder that history is a mix of facts and legends. His story is that of a man who became a legend, but whose story was, in some way, obscured. His story is that of a man who defied the conventions of his time, and who, because of that, was forgotten by history.